Welcome to the Complete Bible Overview, Part 2, as we continue putting the pieces of the Bible together. So I'm hoping that you are here because you completed Part 1. If not, no problem. You can jump into any of the content in Part 2. But if you have not yet gone through Part 1, I would highly recommend doing it because we set a lot of foundations and we cover a lot of key topics there that we're going to build on in Part 2. And in Part 1, goodness, we covered quite a bit. There were 11 modules in Part 1. 10 of them were content. One of them was a review of this one, of all Part 2, which we're going to be diving into now. But these were what we covered in Part 1, and there was a lot. We did a module on just intro and overview about the Bible. We talked about everything that happened before creation, the angels, and all of that, the fall and all that stuff, all the fall of the fallen angels. We talked about creation itself, how God created the physical realm. We spent a module talking about the fall of man, a very, very important topic, because that, of course, sets the story in motion as far as mankind is concerned. And then we started going through the key characters, the real storyline. We went from Adam to Noah in Module 5, and then from the flood to Abraham. We paused and did a whole module just on the importance of Abraham. And then we went from Abraham to Joseph and just started being able to look at the Abrahamic Covenant and how this started to begin to play out in history. And then we went to Moses, looked at the Exodus and the law. And we ended really going the biggest stretch of all of them, which was from Moses to Samuel. And then we did a week of kind of looking forward into this module, everything that we're going to cover. So what are some things that we've learned so far? Let's kind of pause before we dive into this particular course, Part 2. Let's review just some of the key things that we learned in Part 1. One of the things is, of course, that mankind is precious to God. God has created man to be in relationship with him. The problem is that mankind doesn't want that. We're in a state of rebellion against God. Sin has affected every part of us, and therefore we are in rebellion against God. And so therefore, what has God done? Well, he hasn't cast us aside. Thankfully, what he has done is he has initiated a rescue plan to redeem us, to redeem and restore fallen man. And that was a plan that actually began in the Garden of Eden. Even the very first prophecy is Genesis 3:15. That's right there in the Garden of Eden. But this plan started in the garden with Adam and Eve when the fall occurred. It continues through the nation of Israel, the nation that God had selected to use for a number of different purposes. Ultimately, though, was to bring forth the completion, and that it's going to be, this plan is completed in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, the timeline isn't, of course, completed, but the rescue operation is completed. It finds its completion in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And that's where we're going to end in Part 2, but we have a lot to get to before that. So let's pause and let's say, up to this point, what have we established? Well, one of the things that we've established is that God's people are under two different covenants. And this is a little bit of review, but I want to make sure that we go over it and we review it before we get into Part 2. The first covenant is, of course, what? You know this. We went through this. This is the Abrahamic Covenant. Now, let me ask you a question. Is this conditional or unconditional? Is this covenant based on anything but God, or is it based on God alone? This is a unconditional covenant. So this was a covenant, as we talked about, that had to do with a man, a nation, and then that nation being a blessing. That we got that in Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3. And so God was going to choose this man, Abram, through whom he was going to create a nation, and that nation was meant to be a blessing. This was not dependent on Abram's obedience, though he was obedient. This was all on God. This covenant is God's covenant. There's nothing that we can do to break it. The second covenant is, which one? You know it. It's the Mosaic Covenant. Now, is this one conditional or unconditional? This one is conditional. This is important, right? Because the Mosaic Covenant was based on their being the children of Israel, or the Jews, their obedience to God's command for them. And that the Mosaic Covenant actually contained some things that are moral and still apply today, some universal laws, but they also contained a lot of civil laws and religious laws, ceremonial laws, for them only at that time, many of which are now done away with. But there are parts of the Mosaic Covenant, of course, as we covered, that will never be done away with, things like universal morality and the Ten Commandments and such. So God's people up to this point are under two different covenants. And we got to remember this, because these covenants drive everything that happens after this. So where are we going now? Well, one of the things that we need to make sure that we get right off the bat are the 12 major events of the nation of Israel, because these 12 events shape the complete biblical storyline when it comes to the salvation history of God's people. The major events that the Bible records, the people that God used, their obedience, their disobedience, all of these things are wrapped up in these major events. So we need to know these events. And by the end of part 2, you're going to know these all by heart, because we're going to cover them in depth. But what I want to do is I want to start looking at those in the next unit. So in the next unit, join me as we review what we talked about a little bit at the very end of part 1. Looking into this, we're gonna review again the 12 major events of the nation of Israel.